the door swung open before I finished knocking. My mother stood in the entryway with a dish towel over one shoulder and mascara already running, which meant she'd been crying for at least 20 minutes. Behind her, the living room was full of people I hadn't invited, streamers I hadn't chosen, and a banner in gold foil that read, "Congratulations Maya and Derek," in letters large enough to read from the street. I hadn't said yes yet. I hadn't even been asked. Derek had called my mother. He'd called his mother. He'd called our college friends and my coworkers, and apparently the woman I barely knew from spin class, because there she was near the cheese board, holding a plastic champagne flute and smiling at me like we were close. He'd planned the entire thing without saying a word to me, because that was Derek. He didn't ask. He announced. "Surprise," my mother whispered, reaching for my hand. I let her take it. I smiled. I walked inside and hugged people whose names I had to remind myself of, and I accepted a glass of champagne I didn't drink. And I stood beside Derek while he put his arm around my shoulders and told the room the story of how he'd planned this night for months, how much he loved me, how certain he was about our future. He never looked at me while he talked. Not once. I kept waiting for the question. The actual question. The one that was supposed to be mine to answer. But it never came. There was no bent knee, no ring pulled from a pocket, no pause where the room went quiet and I was given the floor. There was only Derek, narrating a story about us in which I was a supporting character. A detail. A prop in the tableau of his certainty. Somewhere around the time he started talking about the house, he'd already been looking at the one in his neighborhood, near his gym. 3 miles from everything I'd built for myself over the last 6 years. I stopped hearing the words. I started hearing something else instead. Something quieter, older, further down. I set my glass on the nearest table. Then I picked up my coat and my keys, walked back through the front door, and kept going. I drove for 2 hours before I realized I was heading north. I didn't plan it. My hands just kept steering, past the city limit signs, past the rest stops and the toll booths, past the point where my phone signal got unreliable and the GPS started rerouting in circles. The sky ahead of me turned the color of hammered pewter. The trees thickened, the road narrowed. I stopped at a gas station somewhere outside Augusta to fill the tank and eat a granola bar from the bottom of my bag, and that was when my phone lit up with 37 missed calls. I turned it face down and drove the rest of the way in silence. The town of Harlow Point sat at the end of a peninsula so thin on the map it looked like an afterthought. Population, maybe 800, give or take the summer people who came for the lobster shacks and the fog and then disappeared by October. My grandmother had left me a small house there when she died 2 years ago, a gray shingled cape with a warped front step and a kitchen that smelled permanently of wood smoke and salt air. I'd been meaning to sell it. I'd told Derek I was planning to sell it. He'd agreed. It made more financial sense to liquidate the asset. I let myself in with the spare key hidden under the porch planter and stood in the dark hallway for a long time, listening to the house breathe. It wasn't a sad sound, it was just old, patient. Like it had been waiting. I found a quilt in the cedar chest at the foot of my grandmother's bed and wrapped it around my shoulders and sat on the back porch until the sun came up over the water. The fog was so thick I could only see about 20 feet of ocean before the world just stopped, swallowed into white. Somewhere out there, a buoy bell clanged at irregular intervals, lazy and unhurried, like it had nowhere better to be. For the first time I couldn't remember how long, neither did I. I called my best friend that morning. She picked up on the first ring, which told me she'd been awake waiting. "I saw the Instagram story," she said before I could speak. "Derek posted about the party. You weren't in any of the photos after 9 o'clock. I left." A pause. Good. Everyone's going to think I had a breakdown. Everyone who matters already knows what Derek is like. Another pause, this one longer. "Where are you?" "Men." She made a sound that was half laugh, half exhale. "Of course you are you okay?" I looked out at the fog. The buoy clanged. A seagull landed on the railing and regarded me with the blank professionalism of something that had seen much worse. "I think I might stay for a while," I said. She didn't try to talk me out of it. Derek called 7 times that first day and then switched to texts, which was a strategy shift I recognized. His texts started apologetic and escalated to confused and then landed, by evening, at a register I could only describe as wounded authority. I did this for you, Maya. I thought you'd be happy. I thought this is what you wanted. I read each one and then set the phone back down on the kitchen table, face up this time, watching the screen go dark on its own. I hadn't known what I wanted, that was the honest answer. But I was starting to understand what I didn't want, and that felt like progress. I went into town the next morning for coffee and encountered Harlow Point in its off-season form, which was to say mostly shuttered and almost entirely unbothered by my existence. The cafe on the main street was open. The hardware store was open. The bait shop was open. Everything else was plywood over glass, waiting for May. I ordered a coffee from a woman behind the counter who introduced herself as Patrice and asked where I was staying with the directness of someone who considered geography to be an appropriate first question. When I told her about my grandmother's house, her expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. Helen Bascom's granddaughter, she said. Not a question. Yes. She slid the coffee across the counter with a nod that seemed to settle something. She was good people. Lived here 40 years and never once acted like she was doing us a favor. I took that as the welcome it probably was. I started working remotely from the kitchen table, which was drafty but had a view of the water. My design clients didn't know or care where I was, only that deadlines were met, and I was the kind of person who met deadlines the way some people kept religious observances faithfully, without being asked, as a matter of basic integrity. I worked in the mornings. In the afternoons, I walked. Harlow Point in November was not beautiful in any way a postcard would acknowledge. The trails above the shore were stripped bare, the beach was more rock than sand, and the wind came off the water with a personal quality, like it specifically disagreed with your choices. But there was something about walking into that wind, leaning into it, letting it take your hair and your coat and your composure, that started doing something to me I couldn't name. Every afternoon, I walked a little further. Every afternoon, I felt a little more like myself, and a little less like the woman who had stood in that decorated living room, holding a glass of champagne she didn't choose. I found the dog on a Tuesday. He was sitting at the end of the boat launch, which didn't belong to anyone in particular, and therefore belonged to everyone, which was apparently also true of him. He was enormous and the color of a rain cloud, and he had one ear that stood up and one that didn't, giving him an expression of permanent mild bewilderment. There was no caller, there was no one calling for him. He looked at me with the incurious patience of something that had made peace with its situation and would appreciate company if I had any to offer. I sat down on the dock beside him. He leaned into my arm. I named him Harbor. Patrice told me he'd been showing up around the point for about 3 weeks, ever since someone spotted him on the side of the highway near the on-ramp. Half the town's been feeding him, she said, with the tone of someone who had also been feeding him. Nobody's claimed him official. I'm keeping him, I said. She refilled my coffee without commenting, which I took as approval. Harbor slept at the foot of my grandmother's bed and followed me on my afternoon walks and regarded the ocean with the measured skepticism of a creature who had been disappointed before and was choosing cautious optimism. He was the best thing about my days, and he didn't ask anything of me except proximity and the occasional ear scratch and that I keep showing up, which, it turned out, was exactly the kind of relationship I needed to practice. Derek stopped texting around the 2-week mark. Then he started again, different tone, softer. I miss you. Can we talk? I read those and felt something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite relief, more like the awareness of a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped feeling it as weight, only noticing it now by its absence. I didn't write back. The harbormaster's office was a low-wood building at the end of the main pier, and I passed it every afternoon without thinking much about it until the afternoon I almost walked into the man coming out of it. He caught my arm before I stumbled. Harbor, who had been occupying himself with a fascinating smell 3 feet to my left, turned and evaluated the situation with his trademark expression of mild academic interest. Sorry, I said. My fault. He stepped back and looked at Harbor with the recognition of someone who had also been on the receiving end of that look. This the highway dog? He is, His name's Harbor. The corner of his mouth moved. That's a good name for him. His name was Cal. He ran the harbormaster's office in the off-season on a part-time basis and built furniture the rest of the time, pieces that he sold through a co-op in Portland and occasionally to the summer people who discovered his workshop and couldn't bring themselves to leave without something. He had a daughter named Rosie who was 7 and spoke approximately 4 words per day, none of them wasted. Her mother had left when Rosie was 4, not dramatically, not cruelly, just thoroughly, in the way of someone who had mistaken a place and a life for the right place and the right life and discovered the error too late. Cal had stayed. Rosie had stayed. The town had absorbed the fact of their situation without commentary, which was either the kindness of community or the efficiency of a small place that didn't have bandwidth for prolonged judgment. I learned these things gradually. That was important. There was no moment where I sat across from Cal at a table, and he narrated his history the way Derek had narrated ours smoothly, with a clear thesis, all the inconvenient parts edited for the listener's comfort. I learned about his life the way you learn things in a small town, sideways, over time, through context and proximity and the occasional direct question that he answered without performing the answer. The first time I saw Rosie, she was sitting on the dock with a sketchbook, drawing something I couldn't see. She didn't acknowledge my presence. She didn't ignore it either. She simply continued existing in her own space with a completeness that most adults spend their whole lives chasing. I sat down nearby. Harbor went and lay beside her with the gentleness he reserved for people who needed it, his big gray head on his paws, and she put one small hand on his back without looking up from her drawing. We sat like that for maybe 20 minutes. Then, she held up the sketchbook and showed me the page. It was Harbor, recognizable, despite the age of the hand that drew him, one ear up and one ear down, his face full of that characteristic bewilderment. In the bottom corner, she'd drawn a small figure that I understood, after a moment, was supposed to be me. You got his ears exactly right, I said. She looked at the drawing, then at Harbor, then back at the drawing, with the seriousness of someone verifying technical accuracy. Then she closed the sketchbook and went back to looking at the water. I kept showing up at the dock. She kept drawing. By December, the temperature had dropped to a register that was less weather than ideology, and I had replaced my city coat with a wool-lined canvas jacket I'd found hanging in my grandmother's mudroom, stiff with salt and age, but impervious to wind. Patrice had started leaving a coffee on the counter for me when she heard the door, which was the local equivalent of a formal declaration of acceptance. The man at the hardware store, whose name was apparently also Cal, which Patrice clarified by calling them Young Cal and Hardware Cal, without apparent awareness of the comedy, had started setting aside supplies for me because I'd been doing repairs on the house, with the determination of someone discovering that physical labor was its own kind of therapy. I replaced the front step. I resealed the kitchen windows. I pulled up the warped floorboard in the back hallway and found, underneath it, a tin box containing 3 photographs of my grandmother as a young woman and a note in her handwriting that said only it gets cleaner from here. I didn't know if she meant the view or something else entirely. I put the photographs on the mantel and thought about her for a long time. She'd moved to this house when she was 32. She'd been married once and widowed young and had not remarried, not because of grief or isolation but because, as she'd told me once when I was old enough to ask, she'd found that she was better company for herself than most people gave her credit for. I'd been 20 when she told me that, and I'd thought it was sad. I was 30 now, and I thought it was the sanest thing I'd ever heard. Derek showed up on a Saturday. I knew it was going to happen eventually. That was the thing about Derek, he was persistent the way a structural problem is persistent. You could ignore it, but you couldn't outrun it. He drove 4 hours from the city and stood on my front step in the kind of coat that said he'd checked the weather but not the terrain, looking at the house with an expression that communicated, without words, that he'd expected something better. You can't just disappear, Maya. I didn't disappear, I moved. You've been here 6 weeks. I know how long it's been. He looked past me into the house with the assessing quality he used when he was calculating. This is what your grandmother left you? You could have gotten good money for this. I know. So what are you doing here? I thought about how to answer that. Through the kitchen window, I could see Harbor's water bowl and the sketches Rosie had given me that I'd stuck to the refrigerator with magnets. I thought about the fog on the water every morning and the buoy bell and the cold that came in off the Atlantic like it had something to say. I thought about how, for the first time in years, I was eating breakfast at a table instead of a standing desk and reading actual books in the evenings. And how my hands had started doing things, hammering, patching, building that my brain could follow without effort, and how that felt like something being returned to me that I hadn't realized had been taken. Living, I said. He stayed 3 hours. He was not cruel. That was the honest thing about Derek. He wasn't a bad person. He was just a person who had never been required to consider that someone else's life might not be a subplot of his own. He left with the slightly wounded bewilderment of a man who had genuinely believed he was doing everything right, and I stood on the porch and watched his car disappear down the Peninsula Road and felt, beneath the discomfort and the leftover tenderness and the complicated arithmetic of 6 years, a clarity that rose steadily like water finding its level. Harbor came and sat on my feet. "I know," I said. He leaned against my legs, and I put my hand on his head, and we stood there until it was too cold to stand there anymore. I'd been working on a corner cabinet for the back hallway, following a YouTube tutorial with the aggressive commitment of someone who had decided that competence was a renewable resource, and she'd simply been spending hers in the wrong direction, when Cal came by to return the level he'd borrowed 2 weeks earlier. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, which was also serving as my workshop, and looked at the cabinet frame with the evaluative squint of someone who knew what they were looking at. "The joints are off," he said. "I know. Want me to show you?" "Not, I can fix that for you." "Not here, let me." Just the offer of the knowledge, the assumption that I was the one who would be doing the work. I handed him the mallet. That became a thing. He'd come by on Saturday mornings and we'd work on whatever I was working on, side by side at the kitchen table, and he'd explain things in the direct, unhurried way of someone who had learned them the same way by doing them wrong first and paying attention to where it went sideways. We talked while we worked, about wood grain and weather and the particular stubbornness of old house bones. About Rosie's school year and the portfolio I was building for a new client and the co-op show he had coming up in Portland. About his grandfather, who had taught him to build things, and my grandmother, who had taught me that a place could hold you steady if you let it. The talking was easy because neither of us was performing it. That was the thing I kept noticing. I'd spent 6 years in a relationship where every conversation felt slightly like a presentation, like we were both making the case for ourselves, continuously, without a verdict ever quite being reached. With Cal, the conversation just went where it went. Sometimes it went quiet for long stretches, and the quiet was fine, filled with the sound of wood and water and Harbor's occasional sighs from under the table. Rosie started drawing Harbor with a small figure beside him regularly now, and the small figure had started wearing a canvas jacket that looked like mine. She left the drawings on the kitchen table for me to find. I pinned them up alongside the others, and one morning Cal came in and looked at the refrigerator covered in her work and was quiet for a moment in a way I recognized as something being felt rather than processed. "She doesn't draw much for people," he said finally. "She doesn't talk much for people either," I said. "But she does for Harbor." He looked at me then. Actually looked, the kind that doesn't move around the room or organize itself into something neutral. "Yeah," he said. "She does." The woman from the co-op came to the workshop in January. Her name was Diane, and she and Cal had apparently been close the previous winter, close enough that the town had opinions about it, and apparently close enough that she had opinions about me. She arrived on a Saturday morning when I was already there and stood in the doorway of the workshop with her arms crossed and her expression arranged into something that was trying to look casual and not quite succeeding. She looked at the cabinet frame. She looked at Cal's tools on my table. She looked at me. "You're Helen's granddaughter," she said. "I am. Cal's been spending a lot of time over here. He's been helping me with some repairs," I said. "He knows a lot about wood." She smiled with just her mouth. "Yes, he does." She didn't stay long. When she left, Cal continued working without looking up, and I let the silence hold for a few minutes before I said, "Was that uncomfortable?" He was quiet for a moment. "It wasn't serious." With her. I want you to know that it wasn't serious. You don't owe me that. No, he said. But I wanted to say it anyway. I put my hands back on the wood. Somewhere in the middle of all that, something had shifted between us, and unlike the shifting I'd been trying to pretend wasn't happening for the last 2 months, this one I let myself notice. I just didn't do anything about it yet, because doing something about it felt less important than being sure of it first. Sure, the way you're sure of a well-built joint. Not because someone told you it would hold, but because you made it yourself and you know how it's made. Rosie got a cold in February that kept her home for a week. Cal dropped her off at my house on the second day with an apologetic expression and a packed bag because a co-op deadline had arrived on a schedule that didn't care about respiratory viruses. Rosie sat on my couch under a quilt with her sketchbook and Harbor beside her, and I made soup from what I had, which was chicken broth and vegetables, and a determination that I was going to figure this out because I was not going to let this child eat from a can. It was not the best soup I'd ever made. But Rosie ate 2 bowls of it and did not complain, which I was beginning to understand was her highest form of praise. That evening, when Cal came to collect her and found her asleep on the couch with Harbor a warm gray wall beside her, he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the pot still on the stove and the drawings spread across the table, and something in his face did the thing it sometimes did, the thing I'd stopped pretending I didn't notice. She told me, he said quietly. Told you what? That she's decided she likes you. She doesn't say that about many people. He paused. She doesn't say that about basically anyone. I looked at the drawings on the table. The small figure in the canvas jacket, Harbor's mismatched ears. The kitchen window with the water view. I like her too, I said. He crossed the kitchen to where I was standing at the counter and he didn't say anything else for a moment, just stood close. Which was its own kind of sentence. Maya, he said. Not a preamble. Just my name, used the way you use something you've been turning over carefully for a long time and want to handle right. I know, I said. He looked at me. You know what I'm going to say? I know what you want to say. I turned to face him. And I want you to say it. I just wanted to make sure you knew I wasn't going to disappear. Are you sure you're not going to disappear? I replaced the front step, I said. I fixed the floor. I've got Harbor and a corner cabinet that's almost square and a refrigerator full of your daughter's drawings. I let that sit for a second. I'm not going anywhere. He reached out and tucked a piece of hair behind my ear with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought about doing that for a while. Good, he said. Diane made her feelings known through the co-op social channels over the next few weeks, in the way of someone who has decided that public opinion is a tool and is not above using it. She told people I was a city transplant with a nostalgia project. She implied that I'd pursued Cal deliberately. She stopped short of anything that could be called outright cruelty, but she worked the edges of it with the precision of long practice. Cal was quiet about it in the way that I was learning meant he was angrier than he looked. He didn't ask me to respond. He didn't respond for me. He just continued being present in a way that made all of it seem considerably less significant than it was trying to be. What actually ended it was Patrice. She stood up at the monthly town board meeting. I was not there, Cal told me later, but he described it in enough detail that I could see it and said, in the carrying voice of someone who had been speaking her mind in this room for 30 years, that Helen Bascom's granddaughter had fixed more of the infrastructure on her grandmother's property in 4 months than the previous renters had in 4 years. That she'd been consistent and good-natured and was teaching the woman's granddaughter. Patrice looked directly at Diane when she said this about soup, which was a skill you'd want in any community member. Nobody laughed because Patrice said it straight. But after the meeting, 3 separate people came over and introduced themselves to me for the first time, and Hardware Cal left a bag of weather stripping on my doorstep with a note that said, for the mudroom door, "The cold gets in on the east side," and that felt, obscurely, like the town had said something. March came with mud and the particular exhaustion of a winter that had lasted long enough to have earned something. The corner cabinet was finished. It was not perfect, the joints were better, but still held the evidence of being the first real thing I'd built, visible if you knew to look, which I thought was honest in a way I appreciated. Cal hung it for me on a Saturday. Rosie, sitting on the kitchen counter eating an apple and supervising with the authority of someone who understood aesthetics. When it was on the wall, she looked at it for a long time. "The lines aren't perfectly straight," she said. "I know," I said. "I made it, so I know exactly where I went wrong." She looked at me. "Does that bother you?" I thought about it. "No. It just means I made it." She turned back to the cabinet and chewed her apple and appeared to be working something out. Then she said, in the offhand tone of her most significant observations, "I want to learn to make things like this." Cal looked at me over her head. I looked at him. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and sawdust and salt air coming through the window I'd left cracked, and Harbor was under the table, and outside the water was silver and still for once. The fog cleared all the way to the horizon for the first time in weeks. "Then we'll teach you," I said. Spring arrived late and sideways, the way it does on a Maine peninsula, less a seasonal change than a negotiation. The fog thinned to something you could see through. The mornings went from punishing to merely brisk. The summer people started driving through to check on their houses, and the shops began pulling the plywood off their windows, and Harlow Point shook itself out like an animal emerging from cover. I stayed. I kept my design clients. I kept the house. I kept working on it, one repair at a time, the list shortening slowly the way good work does. I put my grandmother's photographs back up, but this time in frames I'd chosen, and I planted things in the garden beds she'd left. I didn't entirely know what I was planting, but I had a library book and a willingness to make mistakes, which seemed like enough to start. Rosie came by most afternoons after school. She was 7, then 8, with the birthday falling on a Tuesday in April, and she had opinions about wood grain and strong opinions about soup and occasionally, precisely, devastating opinions about the adult world that she'd offer without preamble and then return to her sketchbook as if she hadn't just said something that would follow you for a week. One evening in late spring, the four of us, Cal, Rosie, Harbor, me, walked the trail above the point as the sun went flat and gold on the water. Rosie was ahead of us, throwing Harbor a stick he kept returning with the cheerful futility of a creature who had decided the game itself was the point. Cal was beside me, close enough that our hands kept brushing, which was not an accident on either side. "You know what Rosie told me last week?" he said. "What?" "She said she'd decided it was okay if I loved you. She wanted me to know she'd decided." I watched her run ahead with Harbor, her voice carrying back to us in fragments, some instruction to the dog, some satisfaction at his response. Some 7-year-old commentary on the nature of sticks and dogs and the general business of being alive. "What did you say?" I asked. "I said I appreciated her input." He paused. "And that I already did." I stopped walking. He stopped beside me. Down below the cliff, the ocean moved in long, slow rolls, catching the last of the light. The buoy bell clanged somewhere to the south, lazy and unhurried, not a warning, just the steady announcement of its own presence. "Say it again," I said. Without the rosy framing. He turned to look at me with the complete, unperformed attention that I had come to understand was just how he looked at things that mattered to him. "I love you," he said. "That's all. I love you, and I'm not performing anything, and I'm not announcing it to a room full of people before you know it, and I'm not asking you to fit into something I've already built. I'm just telling you because it's true, and you deserve to hear true things said plainly." The wind came off the water and pushed at us gently, the way it had that first week when I'd walked into it every afternoon and let it take what it wanted. "I love you too," I said. "And for the record, that's the first time I've said that and meant all of it." He reached for my hand. Not a possession, a choice. I took it. Ahead of us, Rosie had stopped running and turned around, Harbor beside her, both of them watching us with that quality they shared, calm, patient, already certain of something the rest of us were just catching up to. She raised one hand in a wave that was somehow both 7 years old and 40 years old at once. I waved back. I thought about the woman who had stood in a decorated living room 8 months ago, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't chosen, listening to a story about herself in which she had no speaking part. I thought about driving north in the dark with no plan, about the fog and the buoy bell, About the first time I sat on the dock and a cloud-colored dog leaned into my arm and asked nothing except that I remain. I thought about the cabinet with its imperfect joints, and my grandmother's photographs on the mantel, and Rosie's drawings on the refrigerator, and the mudroom door that no longer let the cold in on the east side. I thought about how none of it had looked like starting over. It had just looked like showing up, day after day, to something that was actually mine. The water below caught the last red light of the evening and scattered it into pieces, and Harbor barked once at nothing in particular, and Rosie called something back to us about hurrying up, and Cal squeezed my hand. And I kept walking toward all of it. That, it turned out, was what brave looked like. Not the night I walked out, not the moment I said nothing and drove north and didn't look back. Those were just the beginning, the necessary breath before the sentence. The brave thing was this: staying. Building. Learning to make something with my own hands and not minding that you could see where I'd started. Choosing something that wasn't built around me without my knowledge and calling that love. Knowing the difference. And understanding, finally, that knowing the difference was the whole point. Not the destination, the knowing. The moment you stop and say, not this, not anymore, and mean it. And walk toward whatever comes next, with your hands open, and your eyes open, and your lungs full of cold, Atlantic air that tastes like the truest thing you've ever breathed. I got there, I just had to leave first.